Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, a kind of reasonably familiar face here. It's good to see, as ever, a whole host of familiar faces, and nice to see a few new ones as well today. As was said, my name's Sean Newman. I run product management for Carrero, and we specialise in real-time DDoS protection. Now, as is usual the case, try and avoid talking about product when I stand up here, so we're trying to find something kind of related, but hopefully that's interesting and a bit educational for you. If you remember back to, or those of you who managed to make it up to Edinburgh back in September, you had the joy of being presented to by our head of engineering, because our engineering's based up in Edinburgh. So hopefully you enjoyed that. I think that was the subject there was about high-speed packet processing. But now you're back to being stuck with me, so hopefully that's not so bad. I usually start off by talking a bit about the threat landscape, how DDoS has evolved in the past period since we last got together. I'm going to talk a little bit about that today, but not too much has changed versus what we normally say around how DDoS is presenting itself. So I wanted to take this opportunity to talk to you a bit about some work that we've been doing in the last year or so to kind of update the way our solution works, but basically taking advantage of some opportunities that changes in the edge infrastructure that the edge infrastructure vendors have been making over the past year or two have enabled for us. And this is what the subject about edge mitigation is about. And that should all become clear in the next sort of 10 minutes or so. So what's happened in the the DDoS threat landscape? I often start with this chart to show how attacks have got bigger and more serious and more impactful since the last time we got together. Well, actually, as I just said a few minutes ago, not really much has changed in that respect over the past year. Now, one thing I often say is, a lot of people's perspective of DDoS attacks are these huge hundreds of gigabits moving into terabit scale attacks. When you look at it, these kind of attacks only happen once or twice a year, usually. That's not the true picture of DDoS, and I'll go on to talk a bit more about that in a second. But the last thing that really kind of hit the headlines was this Memcached attack, which was almost a year ago. It was back in the end of February last year that kind of hit the streets. And I talked in reasonable detail about that back at UKNOF in Manchester last year. But not really a lot has gone on since then. Now, if you look at the broader kind of activity from cyber criminals in that period, you might kind of realise maybe why that might be the case. Botnets have formed a big part of DDoS attacks over the last couple of years, and what we found during the course of last year is a lot of that sort of large botnet activity was actually turned over to cryptocurrency mining. So actually the cyber criminals spend a lot of their time using their botnets to actually generate direct revenue for themselves just by doing cryptocurrency mining. So that kind of explains a bit why we haven't actually seen any more sort of really massive attacks hitting the streets. Does that mean that DDoS has gone away? Well, not at all. We saw some significant evolution during the course of last year from that Memcached attack at the start of the year. We've seen continued evolution of botnets. The Mirai botnet that first captured the cyber criminals' imagination back in late 2016 by using IoT devices. We continued to see variants of that during 2018. I think the sort of publicly noted variants were up into sort of double digits now, the amount of those that have actually kind of been seen to be publicly used to drive things like booter and stressor services. And the IoT devices themselves aren't going away. They're still growing massively in numbers, and the industry that's producing them is not really doing anything significant to do a better job of securing them and make it harder for the bad guys to actually take them over and create these large botnets. We've seen significant changes what we have seen is some significant changes in sophistication of the DDoS attacks. So we might not have seen those massive attacks, but the attacks we are seeing, cyber criminals are getting smarter, like they are in every aspect of the cyber threat these days. So we've seen attacks increase in the number of vectors that get used. We've seen an increasing number of attacks use 10 plus vectors, double-digit number of attack vectors to build the volume of the attack. So sometimes it's incremental, so they'll start with an attack vector and then layer another one on top of that and another one on top of that to build up their volume to get to their tens or hundreds of gigabits of protection. Sometimes they just vary the attack vectors in a way to try and evade any protection that's being put in place. Because if they put one particular attack vector out over time, if someone's trying to defend against that, they can actually put a rule together and potentially create a filter that's going to enable them to stop that particular traffic. If the attack then changes vector or layers another one on top, then that's another filter that needs to be put in place. So if they continually modify the attacks like this, making them dynamic, it makes it much harder for them to be defended against. And the other thing we're seeing is they started to spray the attacks across the whole subnet. So rather than picking one destination IP address and sending the whole volume of the attack to that single IP address, they actually send it to all the IP addresses in the subnet that they want to attack. And the reason they do that, again, is to evade traditional detection. Traditional detection has been built around attacks typically going after one particular IP address. As soon as you have to look at an attack being diluted across every IP address in a subnet, you all smart people in the audience, you can understand why that would be significantly more of a challenge. So the attackers are doing that to try and evade attacks. And the last thing was something I think it may have been about a year or so, I talked about this, is these pulsed attacks. And that was another method that the attackers were using to try and get past traditional defences, using a botnet and modulating its output. So for 5 minutes or so, the botnet will send all its attack at one particular target, and then for the next 5 minutes, it will pull away from that and send all its firepower at another target. Not in the same organisation, just another completely different target. And then it might go to a third one, and then come back to the first one. So each target is seeing a pulse of traffic, DDoS traffic, for a period of time, and then nothing for a period of time. And then it comes back. And what that's doing is trying to evade things like swinging traffic over to cloud services. You think, okay, I'm being attacked. Oh, no, I'm not being attacked. Oh, yeah, I'm being attacked. And creates that kind of confusion. So does all this mean that the general level of DDoS attacks is going down? Well, not at all. If you look back to our last DDoS trends report, we're just in the process of producing our latest one now for the second half of last year. But if you look at our last report from the first half of last year, and if you want any more details, URLs in the presentation, so you can go and look that up afterwards if you're interested. We certainly haven't seen, although we haven't seen those big attacks, we certainly haven't seen any drop in the typical sort of day-to-day attacks that we see. As you can see, a 40% increase in the first half of last year over the previous year. Still in that range of our typical provider customers that are using our solution, seeing 6 to 8 attacks a day. So certainly, no drop in the number of attacks. And the attacks are still having that sort of profile that Carrera has been talking to this audience about for the past couple of years, that the attacks are actually, you get used to attacks being big and saturating. Most of the attacks are actually relatively small and quite short in duration. And we're still seeing that trend continue. You can see there 77% of the attacks, 10 minutes or less, and 90-odd% are in that sort of single-digit gigabits or less. However, one thing we did see in the first half of last year was a bit of an increase in the attacks at the bigger end of the scale. So we saw a doubling of attacks in that sort of 10 gigabit to several tens of gigabits, maybe up to a few hundred gigabits. Not those massive sort of terabit attacks, but just at the larger end of these kind of smaller attacks. And that kind of leads me on to the subject that I wanted to talk about today, because that's quite an interesting thought. Hopefully you can see that okay. The graphics seem to have gone slightly odd on that, but it's only messed up what is a picture of some clouds anyway, so hopefully this is going to work. It's just made them slightly more fluffy. Why this is important, this notion of these sort of attacks potentially shifting to the larger end of that kind of scale of the moderate-sized attacks, is important for providers who have been relying on this sort of traditional way of doing DDoS protection, which is to have a scrubbing center, where you have out-of-band protection, or out-of-band monitoring, which is looking at your traffic coming in. So you're using out-of-band net flow monitoring, looking at traffic coming into your network. Most of the time, that's probably giving you traffic engineering information so that you can understand whether you've got your routing set up right in your environment. But obviously, that same monitoring enables you to detect DDoS attacks. And when that happens, you can use that to scrub your traffic. So sending a BGP redirect to move that traffic over to your scrubbing center. Now, why this is important in relation to what I was just saying about that shift to larger attacks is, by nature of the design of a scrubbing center, the scrubbing center capacity is always fractional compared to the size of your edge capacity. And what we typically see in providers and customers like yourself that we talk to, it's somewhere only around maybe 10% of your edge capacity. Maybe between 10% and 20% sometimes, but often only 10% of your edge capacity. So if you've got 100 gigabit edge, you've got 10 gigabit scrubbing. If you've got a terabit edge, you've got 100 gigabit scrubbing. If attacks are now shifting towards this tens of, few hundreds of gigabits end in higher proportions, that means there's more occasions when the attacks are bigger than your scrubbing capacity. Now, obviously, everything grows over time, so network scale grows over time, and you might expect to grow your scrubbing capacity over time. But if attacks are growing disproportionately towards this larger end, there's going to be more occasions when the attack is bigger than your scrubbing center. So what do you do then? Well, there's only one option that you have to do when you see an attack that's bigger than your scrubbing center. Well, you either get overwhelmed, you haven't done anything, but hopefully you're going to have something in place that enables you to do some kind of upstream black hole, some kind of BGP, RTBH type action to effectively push back on your provider to actually stop that traffic before it gets into your transit connections. But of course, the trouble with that is, it's keeping that traffic off your network, but actually your customer's now offline, so they're not happy. The attacker, he's still succeeding, so he's happy. He doesn't care whether the attack got through and took the target offline, or whether your black holing actions, having to just push back and stop all the traffic to that destination, are taking that target offline. So effectively, everybody's losing there. You might be keeping that traffic off your network, but it's not creating a good situation for you. Maybe 10 years ago, when people, your customers didn't care so much about every bit of uptime, but these days where more and more business is actually transacted over the internet, and websites aren't just storefronts, nobody can afford to be offline, even for minutes. So this kind of activity is obviously not a good position for you to be in. Trying to represent that a bit more graphically, I was using this chart because I'll come back to it in a couple of slides' time. But this kind of represents what's going on. And if we're seeing the attacks, if the blue curve is the sort of your typical distribution of attacks, and we're starting to see the weighting of the attacks pushing into that upper end of the curve, there are going to be more and more times when you're going to have to do black holing versus scrubbing. Now, you could make your scrubbing center bigger, but then there becomes a point when your scrubbing center is approaching the size of your edge bandwidth. Every time you have to do scrubbing, you have to backhaul all that traffic across your core network. If your scrubbing's as big as your core network capacity, you're effectively losing your ability to move good packets as well. So that solution is, kind of has its sort of natural limits, I think. So what we've been looking at is something that kind of came to our attention by from a partnership that we had that we had developed with Juniper, and we became aware of capabilities that they were adding into their routers. And other vendors as well. So I guess in the interest of impartiality, like you would say on the BBC, other router vendors are available. Other router vendors, switching vendors, people like Arista, starting to build, the sort of high-performance vendors, starting to build the ability to do filtering directly in their products. And this is all about enabling the network to be the enforcer of your policies. So taking the sort of traditional approach, we have things like flow monitoring that suffer from things like aggregation today. Things like NetFlow were built to describe traditional, legitimate network flows in your environment. As soon as you put DDoS traffic into a NetFlow engine that's trying to summarize the packets into regular flows, the fact that every packet is different completely kind of screws up the state machine from NetFlow. So it's not good. It can only see header information. Increasingly, as DDoS attackers are getting more evasive, it's getting harder and harder to tell from just the headers what is good traffic and what is DDoS traffic. Increasingly, it helps to be able to look into the payload to be able to determine whether successive packets are actually part of a DDoS flow. And the similar thing happens when you're trying to mitigate as well. So when you're trying to push back on these attacks, trying to use RTBH or maybe flow spec, you have similar challenges. You've got propagation delays, so the attacks hit for a while before the mitigation has a chance to take effect. It's header only, and when you put it in place, you've got limited visibility. If you're pushing back RTBH to your providers, you've got to then put in some mechanisms to know when you're going to actually retract that, those defences, to know when the attack's gone away, when can you get your customers back online. So this approach that we've been investigating with use of the edge filtering capabilities uses a combination of mirroring traffic from the edge to effectively a brain in the centre, which, from our perspective has been reusing our product in a different way, as opposed to deploying it at the edge of the network, deploying it as the brain, as central intelligence in your sort of NOC or your SOC. But that could be your analysts as well, and that could be providing, it could be you doing other kinds of security activities, using that monitoring of the edge of the network, and then being able to deploy policy directly back at that same edge of the network using filters that are built into these latest generation of switching and routing products. So it sort of looks a bit like this. This is the sort of environment that we've been looking at, and found that we've actually had some really good success with this. So been able to take a sampled mirror feed from those edge devices, in this case Juniper Edge, Juniper MX routers that we've been using quite a lot, bringing that intelligence back into the centre of the network, into your SOC or your NOC, either monitoring on your SIEM platform, or in our case with our DDoS detection platform, and then using that intelligence, spotting network anomalies or traffic anomalies or security anomalies that you want to do something about, and either manually pushing those filters down, or through some programmatic API, being able to automatically do that, being able to provision your security policy back directly at that edge of the network. And the benefit of that is it scales. It scales nicely. Every time your network grows and you add more routers or more transit connections, you've inherently got that protection already. You don't then have to go and put more of your specific security devices at each of those points, or increase the capacity of those devices because you increase the capacity of that part of your network. It all just naturally scales. So it's a kind of a win-win situation, really, as far as being able to extend what was traditionally a scrubbing capacity that was limited by cost and topology and scale, to something that you can actually push out right to the edge of the network. So instead of just relying on this scrubbing zone now, going back to this chart that I showed earlier, instead of relying on black hole traffic when something exceeds the scrubbing capacity, you now leverage the ability to apply these filters right at the edge of the network. So you don't have to, you don't have to do any swinging of traffic and backhauling that across your internal network. You've used the remote monitoring and then the ability to apply the filtering right directly at the edge on those infrastructure devices to defend yourself all the way up to that edge protection. And at that point, then, the only attacks that you then have to even consider doing black holing for are then limited to the even rarer cases where something's larger than your transit capacity. So it kind of looks a bit like this with my slightly modified, extra fluffy cloud diagram. Traffic comes in, remote sampled mirroring, so we're seeing every end packets, but we're seeing the whole packet. So back to that point about the limitations with NetFlow and flow spec and things only seeing headers. We're mirroring every packet, so we're seeing the whole packet. We get the header information and we get the payload information for every packet that we see. A DDoS attack comes in. Those DDoS attack packets get mirrored into the NOC as well. So whatever monitoring you're using there, or using our solution to look for DDoS traffic, you spot that over successive packets, something looks like a DDoS flow. You're then able to push the filters straight back to those edge routers and actually implement then that defense right at the edge of the network there. So stopping that good, so allowing the good traffic and surgically stopping that bad traffic with these ACL rules. So what do they look like? So I thought I'd just quickly show you one as an example. I'm nearly finished now. Pretty simple kind of firewall rules. For anyone who's seen a firewall rule before, Okay, maybe the syntax is a little different, but it's pretty easy to understand this. And this is a really simple rule that was designed to block a DDoS charge-end attack, if anyone knows what that is. I'm assuming you're pretty good on TCP UDP ports, so you know what port 19 is. But you can see this filter is basically saying, for this specific IP address, this destination IP address, or for a packet that matches that IP address, that is also a UDP packet, that is also source port 19, then block it. And you can actually see the actions at the bottom. So the top part is the filter, and then the bottom part is the actions. And also within that, we also have the count thing. So the count is important. I didn't really talk much about that on the previous slide, but getting the telemetry back from those edge routers enables you to then understand how effective or how much a particular mitigation is being used. So in this case, every packet that has that destination port, is UDP and has source port of 19, will get counted by that rule, mirrored, so we still see the packet back at the central SOC, NOC intelligence point, so either for monitoring in your SIM or for visibility in our product, and then it gets discarded. So it's dropping it right at the edge of the network. So pretty simple. So you could push those types of rules manually yourselves if you've got threat intelligence feeds that you want to take from just being something that is delivering you intelligence within your SOC to being able to be a security policy that you're enforcing at the edge of your network. You could leverage these capabilities in these routers switching products to actually push policy down yourselves right to the edge of your network. And some security policy that's a bit more static, it's reasonable to do that. You could have some scripting that would programmatically do it for you. So if you had a threat feed update every day, you could have it automatically filter that and push the appropriate things down to make sure keep your policy up to date if it was some IP reputation or something like that. Or conversely, you can hook into it with an API, and that's what we've been leveraging, to actually have automated intelligence be doing that for you as well. And these filters are pushed into a part of, certainly in Juniper's case, pushed into a part of their filtering policy called their ephemeral filters. So they have two parts of the firewall policy. They have a static part, which you can effectively set up, which is kind of permanent and is residual across reboots of the router. And then they have ephemeral rules, which are just kind of by virtue of them being called ephemeral, they're kind of set up to do filtering at certain points in time. So they're perfect for DDoS attacks that come and go. So we use the ephemeral ones, and then we know that through our interface there's no chance of us affecting the main firewall policy either. So quickly in summary, we haven't seen any large DDoS attacks, but are DDoS attacks going away? Are they getting any less severe? Well, no. You've seen from our trends report they're increasing, and it's the sophistication that's increasing as well as the number of attacks. So having something that can actually intelligently look for these DDoS attacks rather than relying on legacy approaches is important. Relying on sort of traditional approaches, using things like RTBH and scrubbing centers, is becoming increasingly challenging, and we're hearing this from a lot of the sort of larger providers that we've been talking to. So the time is right to leverage this new opportunity that the infrastructure devices are giving us. Being able to either manually or automatically push out your security policy directly to those infrastructure devices in a way that means your protection can scale as your infrastructure scales is a great opportunity. And I think that is everything I wanted to say today. So thank you for your attention. Hopefully that was interesting. And if you have any questions now, happy to take them. And if anyone's got any afterwards, we're around all day. And as you heard, we're here for pints and packets, so you can come and have a beer with us as well. We have a question over here. The mic's on.
Hello.
Yep, can hear you.
Hi, Phil from Google. How do you manage the amount of table space or ACL space available in the edge devices and stop yourself from blowing that up?
It's basically because we've been focused on doing DDoS protection, we haven't got to a point where we've actually gone beyond the capacity of those tables. So I guess if you're going to push more and more of your security capabilities to rely on those tables, there is a risk that's going to happen. But in the number of simultaneous DDoS attacks that we've seen in any of the kind of customers that we deploy our solution at, it doesn't get anywhere near the size of those tables.
You wouldn't specifically ban a bunch of source IPs then and run out of the list of source IPs?
No, so we don't. So our protection doesn't do anything to do with source IPs. So that's probably another whole session. But you can come and talk to us if you want to know how our detection works. But we focus on identifying patterns of DDoS rather than doing source reputation, because that you can't do that for DDoS because it's not at all reliable. But thanks for the question.
Rob from Astutium. So are we essentially saying the future is put bloody big firewalls at the edge with ports that are the same size as the largest possible DDoS you're expecting and double your internal capacity so you can mirror it all to a NOC?
Wait a minute, I missed the middle of your question. I missed are we saying that the future is filtering at the edge of the network?
Well, by essentially turning everything into very large firewalls.
So we don't turn it into large files as such. So we use sample mirroring. So for thinking about the sort of scale, we've found that we can be, with the granularity that we have in our detection, we can be effective enough for these large-scale edge mitigations with a sampling rate of 1 in 1,000.
Okay. So you're not mirroring all
It's
the
a sample
traffic.
mirror. Yeah, sorry if I didn't say that. That was an omission on my part of my notes. So I think that it mentioned sample mirror on the one of the slides. I may have just glossed over that, but the key point for us certainly is we can, if we're talking about hundreds of gigabit, terabit scale edge, with 1 in 1,000 sampling, we can see attacks down to sort of single gigabit size attacks just from that sampling. And then if you need to go any more granular, then you can have your scrubbing that's effectively taking every packet for particular flows that you want to protect. But yes, so if you've got a terabit of edge capacity, you're only sending a mirror traffic of 1 gigabit. So just to put it in context, so it's actually really manageable. Even if you've got a very geographically dispersed network, and you effectively wanting to bring the feeds back from all of those routers across that network, backhauling 1 gigabit feeds for every terabit point of presence you have is not unrealistic. Certainly not that we've seen. But good question. Thank you.
Are there any other questions from the floor? Well, because there is one actually that's come in from IRC. Is there a feel for how much DDoS traffic is IPv6? I think that means, has IPv6 reached prime time yet?
So that's an excellent question. I don't think we've broken it out in our statistics. So I think we see some. Certainly all of our detections work across IPv6 as well as IPv4. So it's not that we aren't detecting it in the same way. So I think it's still in the minority, mainly because of the mechanisms that get leveraged for DDoS attacks, so leveraging DNS reflections and NTP and those sort of things. Very much so, they tend to still be in the IPv4 domain, certainly from what we've seen. But I think it's probably something I think we've looked at it as far as calling it out in our threat report, but it's not been significant enough to kind of really warrant that yet. But it's certainly something we'll keep a close eye on. But yeah, that's a good question. Thank you.
Well, if there are no more questions, I'd just like to thank Sean for yet another very interesting talk about the threat landscape. Thank you very much, Sean.
That's great. Thank you. And thanks for your questions, guys. Thank you.